Hello everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Gaming in the Wild, a video games podcast about games from the artistic, creative side of the tracks, from indie to AAA. My name's John, I'm your host, and I have a bit of a special episode for you this week. It's an interview episode, and I was so taken with the game Birth that came out last week. I did a review of it on last week's episode. It's a very interesting, hand-drawn point-and-click with a super strong existential thread going through it and a super strong strand of just humanity and warmth. It's a really interesting game. And so I reached out to Madison Karrh, who created that game, and Madison agreed to come on the show and have a chat. It's the fourth developer interview that I think I've had on the show. We've talked to Gareth Damian Martin, who made In Other Waters, and we've talked to the developers behind Signs of the Sojourner and Norco. They're always really popular episodes, and I love doing them. It's great to talk to the developers behind the games and hear about the creative process and get to ask a few questions about the games, their making of them, the conception of them, and so forth. It was a really good conversation with Madison, and I'm excited to share it with you today. But before we get to the interview, I will, of course, as always, do a little roundup of what I've been playing and what's been going on. Since the last episode, or maybe just before, maybe the day I published the last episode, Double Fine, the developers of Psychonauts and many, many, many other games over the years, they released a huge documentary series about the making of Psychonauts 2. It's immense. I think there are over 20 hours of documentary footage taken over 5 or 6 years. It has 32 episodes in the series. I'm a big fan of video game documentaries. I'm a big fan of No Clip. I mention it here on the podcast quite often. But this is something on the scale of which I don't think we've quite seen before in terms of documenting the trajectory and the development cycle of a single game. And I've actually binged the entire thing. I just couldn't stop watching it. I think partially because the characters at the center of Double Fine are very watchable, amenable, funny people. Tim Schafer, of course, is the head of the studio, one of the writers of The Secret of Monkey Island, and a beloved game developer. He is in it a lot, but the whole team that surrounds him, the culture at Double Fine, the problems that they had in developing the game were fascinating to see. I had no idea that Psychonauts 2 had taken quite as long as it did, and that it was such a slightly, I wouldn't say a troubled development cycle, but definitely protracted. It was very interesting to see levels in their first flush, when people had ideas about the different brains that you go into in Psychonauts. If you haven't played Psychonauts, it's a game where you play a psychic called Raz. And what Psychonauts do is that they dive into the heads of people who have psychological issues, and they try and fix them by playing through these inner worlds, which are represented in really interesting levels that bring together, if someone has strong feelings of guilt, then that will be visualized somehow, or if they have problems with addiction, with gambling in this case, then that is represented in the levels too. So it was really fascinating seeing all of the ideas being written out on post-its, pinned up on a board. It seemed like at some points there were hundreds of ideas, and they were combining them all in different configurations, trying to come down to the perfect level that would represent the character in question, their internal dialogue, their motivations, and how that ties into the story, and also how that is synthesized into interesting gameplay scenarios. It was absolutely fascinating to see early iterations of levels. It was fascinating to see the staff coming in, bringing with them cultures from other studios and how that impacted on the working culture at Double Fine, which seems very specific. So I'm very impressed with that documentary series, and it did inspire me to go back to Psychonauts 2 and playing through it with the knowledge that you have after watching the entire documentary is fascinating. You can see the levels that went through so many different iterations that were torn up, redesigned, Some elements kept, some thrown away. Some of the join marks, I remember when I reviewed Psychonauts 2, I had some notes about it, about some of the gameplay feeling disjointed, or some of the levels being wildly imaginative, but kind of hard to play sometimes in terms of signposting, knowing where you were supposed to go next in these very busy environments that they created. So it was really interesting to go back and revisit Psychonauts 2. Some of the best levels in that game, for example, the music festival level, which is a very psychedelic, colourful journey through a music festival where you're bringing a band back together. It turns out that as one of the more polished levels of the game, and the same goes for the opening level where you're inside the brain of Dr. Loboto, a kind of crazed dentist. Those were two of the best levels in the game, and it was really interesting to learn that both of those were shown at E3. So they were some of the first segments of the game that the world ever saw. And as such, there was huge pressure poured onto those levels and huge amounts of resources, playtesting, sanding. So it was really interesting that in retrospect, I can see why some of the levels that were the best levels in the game became the best levels in the game because there was so much pressure on them, whereas other levels went through various iterations and staffing changes and design philosophy changes and were perhaps less successful or less sanded down in different ways. Very, very insightful. It also made me go and visit Psychonauts, the Rhombus of Ruin, the kind of interlude between Psychonauts 1 and 2 that was designed for the PSVR. And seeing the development cycle of that one, of a team that had never worked with VR before, and seeing the staffing stresses of having people pulled away from the VR project to work on Psychonauts 2, because that was in full swing as well. It just gives you a whole new slant on those games and a new way to understand them and a new way to understand game development generally. So I heartily recommend the Double Fine. I think it's called Psycho-Odyssey. I will put a link to it in the show notes. If you haven't seen it, I recommend checking it out. It's like a vast Netflix reality series all about the inner workings of Double Fine. It taught me a lot about the inner workings of Double Fine and about game development generally. And I think I will come back and review the Rhombus of Ruin in full, but I want to keep the intro short in this episode. So I have been playing Psychonauts. I've also been playing a little bit of Wild Hearts. This is a monster hunting game that came out recently. There is a demo of it on Xbox Game Pass and on PlayStation if you have EA Play. I played through the whole demo. It was really, really fun, to the point at which I got really absorbed, to my own surprise, in this process of tracking down these monsters by building scanner towers and upgrading all of your weapons, upgrading all of your armor, taking on side quests to go and hunt down monsters that are causing problems for locals in this high fantasy samurai world. I loved it so much that when I reached the end of the demo, where you enter the big city at the heart of the map, I immediately bought the game. This is a full-priced game, so that's pretty rare for me to buy a full-priced, high-budget game of this type. But I've been playing Wild Hearts. I've been really enjoying it. I even dabbled in some multiplayer. If you listen to the show, you'll know that's not usually my scene, but it was seamless, it was fun, and I've been having other people hop into my hunt and helping other people out on theirs. So I'll be talking more about the Rhombus of Ruin in the future. I'll be talking more about Wild Hearts in the future. I also finally cracked open A Space for the Unbound, the pixel art adventure on the Switch set in Indonesia in the 1980s. That's been very interesting too. I'm playing through that one. I've played through 3 hours of it. I think it's a 10-hour game. So lots to talk about in the episodes that are coming up. And you can expect to hear more from me about all of those games in the future. And just before we dive into that interview with Madison, let me mention this is a patron-supported show. So if you like this show, if you like the podcast, if you're a long-time listener who listens every week, or if you're a first-time listener today, then hello, and I'm happy that you found the show. You can support the show in various ways. I always appreciate people sharing it on social media, sending it to a friend, rating it on Spotify, leaving reviews on Apple, and also people that sign up to support the show on Patreon for $1 a month or more. If you sign up on Patreon, you get access to our Discord server, where there's a whole bunch of people talking about what they're playing, sharing free games that you can grab, sale titles, doing Wordle, doing Guess the Game, and just having a great time. You also get a whole bunch of bonus episodes. So if you would like to support the podcast that way, you can do so at patreon.com/gaminginthewild. And I will leave a link to that in the show notes too. And with all of that housekeeping out of the way, let's move on to the interview. Hope you enjoy it. I had a lovely chat with Madison, such a nice person and such an interesting game developer. I really recommend checking out Birth. It's available on Steam now for Mac and PC. So here is that interview, and enjoy the rest of the show. So I am super happy to be joined this week by the creator of the game Birth, Madison Karrh. Hello Madison, how are you?
Hi John, I am good. How are you?
Doing great, thank you. Doing great, really happy to talk to you. I guess it's a bit of a big week for you. We're talking like 3 days before the game comes out. So how are you feeling right now?
Oh, I am very, very nervous. Very excited. I think the ratio of nervous and excitement, right now I'm more excited than I am nervous, but as we get closer to launch, I know that the nervousness will take up a higher percentage of my overall emotions. So it's really weird to be done with it after working on it for so long and having press play it for the past few weeks. It's weird for it to be done but not out yet. I'm really excited for people to play it. I hope that people like it, and I hope the internet is nice to me.
Seems like they will be. I mean, I've been following Birth for a bit, at least since it was in the Summer Games Fest Day of the Devs thing last year. That was the first time I saw it, and immediately transfixed by it. And I've sort of Googled around and seen what was happening with the game, and there was some really interesting shots of you showing the game at festivals or like little game events. So has that been going on for a while? Have you been showing it to people just on the down low or sort of out there in the world?
Yeah, this past year, this is the first time I'm showing a game and like admitting that I want it to do well, which is kind of an embarrassing thing to do, but it's what you have to do, obviously, if you want to make a thing. So I showed it at Day of the Devs. I think that was the first time that a lot of people saw it. It was at WASD in London, but I didn't go because it was like right when things were kind of opening back up that year, and wasn't super comfortable traveling. But then we did Day of the Devs over the summer. And so that was a huge jump in terms of audience. I've released 2 games before, but to very few people, I guess. I didn't do a ton of marketing or a ton of showing it at all. So this is my first time going to shows. So Day of the Devs and Gamescom, and then another Day of the Devs in November. They do two different events. Which is a lot of work, and it's a lot of emotional vulnerability. I think when you're making something so personal, to just have a bunch of strangers kind of test it out. And you get to see their live reaction versus just putting it on the internet. At least there's a veil of if someone doesn't like it, you won't know. They likely won't just harass you for no reason. So, but this is my first time showing it. And luckily, it's just been a very humbling and positive experience seeing people play it and getting tons of feedback.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked seeing the photo of a little Birth kind of booth in a show, and it was next to other games, and the palette was so different. It's got this sort of papery color and bone color and eggshell color, and it's all so different and sort of pulled down next to sort of, Shantae type games with sort of very bright, sort of pixely purples and super bright colors. It seems to leap out in a really unusual way by being quieter than what was around it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I definitely was kind of insecure showing up and realizing that Birth was so much more minimal than the other booths. But I do think you're right. As a result of everyone else trying to grab your attention, Birth kind of does stand out in its quietness.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I did actually go back and play Landlord of the Woods yesterday.
Oh, lovely. That's so nice.
Because it turns out you've got 3 games up on Steam now. I didn't know that. I've been backtracking from finding out about Birth first.
Yes. What did you think of Landlord? Did you like it?
Really enjoyed it. It's super interesting by contrast to Birth. It's similar mechanically, of course, but it's been refined a little in Birth. Similar art style, which was really nice to see, like that there's sort of a strong style across the 3 of them, and similarly vulnerable personal subject matter on a different tack, I guess. That one seemed to be about kind of they all seem to be engaging with different aspects of modern life a little bit. If Birth is about loneliness and love, then Landlord of the Woods seemed to be about work and about confidence and that sort of thing. So it seemed like it was like exploring like a slightly different strand of life, but in a similarly personal way.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I definitely did not set out either time to make an autobiographical game, but I think just as making something on your own goes, I think you just naturally pour yourself into it, and it becomes you. So it is definitely working on something by yourself. You don't have as much of a veil when it comes to the story and who you are. So it definitely just comes out on accident. But I've never set out to just make an autobiographical game. But at the end of Landlord, I was like, oh, I am 25 and I am not happy with my current job. And then obviously with Birth, it was like, oh, I am living in a tiny studio apartment. And I would love to have a custom built human for sure.
And I guess, yeah, because these are truly solo. I mean, there's a lot of solo dev, small studio kind of games that come out, but these seem like truly single person made projects, right? Because you do the artwork and the writing and the coding. I was actually curious if you do the music too, because on the credits there is only Madison Karrh. So did you make the music for these games as well? I
did, but it's just classical public domain music rekeyed. So I'm definitely not writing any music. That music and audio are my, I would say, my weakest link. I do think that sound effects are very fun. For the most part, that's just recording sounds around Chicago and in my apartment. So that part is fun, but the music is, I think for my next game, I would like to work with a composer that has a little bit more control emotionally, I think, over. I'm glad that it turned out well with Birth, but I don't think there's only so many public domain classical songs that you can rekey. So
I thought that was the case. I recognized, I think, 2 of them, and I had sort of tingles of recognition of all of it. But there were a couple where I was like, wait, I think I know this one.
Yeah, it's kind of a fun game to play to try to pick out which song is in which building for sure.
So yeah, if they are like, I think maybe that's why they've come out autobiographically unintentionally, is that like if there's a team working on something, you get bits of everyone, right? Like when you watch documentaries about something like Supergiant, where they've got some very strong, like very talented people in different areas, and they kind of have to negotiate bits in and lose bits that they love in the game and stuff like that. So you end up with this group effort. And I think like Greg Casavin has said in the No Clip documentary that if he was left to his own devices, they would be intensely different games, which is an interesting thing to say as he's the head of the studio and so forth. But the fact that you're making these all yourself, like across such a long time, I guess this one looks like it's been 3 years in development, right?
Almost 2 years.
Almost 2.
Yeah. In terms of like, I didn't really know what I was making before. There was like a gap between finishing Landlord and then starting Birth, where I was kind of working on miscellaneous things and trying to come up with ideas. So I've been like diligently working on it for about 1.5 years.
And if it does come together gradually, it seems like when looking at Birth, it seems like we're looking at the pages of a sketchbook of yours with lots of like lovely little illustrations of leaves and jars and bones, and it just seems like there could be books and books and books of this. Like, and you've kind of pulled out the certain aspects of it and assembled it in this really interesting way, like almost like paper crafty, with these autobiographical bits of text in there and lovely little bits of sound in there. And because it is all you and across like a long time, it seems like it's really taken on this life, I guess, a little bit like the thing that you're making in the game, right?
Yeah, I've never really thought about it as like it is like almost a physical journal. I like think of the metaphor of it being kind of like a diary, but I am drawing all of the things, so it's almost like a digital journal of my life at that time, which is very vulnerable to have on the internet.
Right, and I was thinking about your mode of autobiography as well, actually, because I've found as someone has made stuff myself in the past, when you put a lot of yourself into it, there's always this fine line that I end up walking where I'm like, am I indulging myself? Am I revealing too much and that sort of thing? But I've kind of ended up in a good place with that now where, I don't know, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about that stuff?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, especially with part of the process of Birth is obviously doing interviews and and talking to people who are much better at words than I am. And a lot of times people will make observations about birth that I didn't know were in the game, but that I do resonate with. And it's weird to think that somehow someone is almost seeing through me by playing birth, which feels very, I know I keep using the word vulnerable, but that is what it feels like. It does feel like opening yourself up. And I think since birth has such little dialogue or text in it, there's a lot of room for projection, and a lot more of yourself comes out, I think, when you're not explicitly typing out the words that you're feeling. And so other people can put themselves in there too. But for the most part, I think talking to other people who almost understand on birth on a deeper level than I do is very weird. It's very, very weird to hear people telling me their thoughts, which are my thoughts that I didn't know I was sharing with them.
Right. I ended up, after making some autobiographical work that was pretty raw, ended up thinking through it and seeing how people responded to it. People responded warmly to it, and they seemed to feel seen when they saw this. Like, it's not things that people say or reveal every day. And so by revealing things that do seem very self-oriented, you're actually being generous by opening that up for people to see that other people feel the way that they feel, right? Yeah,
and I don't know if you feel this way about your work, but I do think if you're making something by yourself, that is something that you, as a solo developer, you can lift that veil and extend your hand and say, do you want to hold hands right now? Where like you were saying with bigger teams, there's way more people that have to form this much bigger hand that might not fit necessarily someone else's. So it feels a bit less natural or less close. I don't know exactly where I was going with that, but I don't know if that's, did you stop making self works because of the vulnerability, or did you just move on into other mediums and stuff?
Yeah, just moved on. I wrote, it was like doing art about just trying to record every thought that one has as rapidly as possible for a set period of time, and then turning it into, with absolutely no editing and no kind of taking anything out, just the whole thing.
Oh, amazing.
And just doing that for a period of time and then collecting those into text. But that was a project that had a start and an end, if you know what I mean. But
okay, yeah.
I do love work that does tell you more about the person than you could have access to in any other way. It's kind of, I wish that everyone would do that. It would be easier to understand people.
Yeah, I value humanity in work so much. I love any amount of, just person that's in the game. I think I value that in stories. And I think with books, obviously, they have that kind of down pat, because usually you write a book just as one person. Of course, there's co-authors and stuff, and editors as well. But they have a much more through line of they write the thing and you read the thing, where games, obviously, since it takes so much work and is just a miracle that anything ever gets finished at all, obviously. I think you can you do have to make compromises with other humans' brains too.
Right, and it is interesting to have played Landlord and played it next to Birth, and to look at them together and to see that, you've just said, that there were moments in your life where you were making and they unintentionally took on all of the feeling and the concerns that you had at those moments. I have not played Whimsy yet. I didn't have time to squeeze it in before we talked, but I will play that one too, and I'm curious to see how that fits with the others. But it's nice to see them kind of as on a trajectory of some kind, and sort of starting to map out a little bit of you through the games.
It's also nice because Whimsy was the first game that I put out, and it's very rough, I will tell you, from UI. I love looking at it just from a sweet nostalgia standpoint of I was such a baby when I made that, and I didn't know how there's this beauty in ignorance almost of if you don't know how good something can be, you're more comfortable putting it out. So with Whimsy, obviously now I would never release Whimsy in the state that it was in. And the same with Landlord. There's so many bugs in Landlord, and so many things when I see people playing it or when I go back and play it, I would fix now. But I'm so thankful that at the time I just didn't know. I couldn't see the roughness for what it was. I was just like, so, I don't know, so excited to be making things that I'm so glad that I did end up finishing things and putting them out, because I could easily see how you could work on something forever and keep, if you're growing and making new things. I think I'm glad that I was making smaller things that were finishable versus if I started with a bigger game, I would still be working on it, and you wouldn't have those like timestamps of like, oh, this is what I was making when I was in 2019 and this was 2020. So I'll be interested to hear what you think of Whimsy, because it's definitely rougher, but it is still vulnerable in a different way, I think, in just a way that was like, I was not very good at my craft yet and still put it out on the internet. So I hope you appreciate it for what it is and not necessarily. I'm glad Whimsy was not the first one that you played.
No, the first one was Birth, and thank you for sending me over a code to play it. It was really fun to, after playing the demo, to get access to the whole thing. And
thank you so much for playing it and catching bugs too.
Actually, you know what? I didn't find a single bug in Landlord in the Woods, so it was a completely clean playthrough.
Oh, that's amazing.
But it's lovely that it's finally here, and it is the longest game that you've made by some stretch and seems to have the most in it. So has it felt like a kind of a natural process of building on the things that you've done and the things that you've learned and adding to it over time? Yeah,
definitely. And I think before that, both of my games were very linear, and so Birth has more of like a there's still a linear progression, and you still have to do X amount of things before you can reach the ending, but you have much more choice, and it feels a lot more like exploring a city and like trying to go in different buildings, and maybe some are closed or some aren't open yet. I think in terms of length, I don't really know how long a point and click game can be while still being like succinct and tight. And so I think 2 to 3 hours, an hour and a half to 3 hours, that's like a sweet spot for me. And so now I think, now that I've like reached this skill set to where I can make a longer game, I would just like to focus my next game on just like packing that hour and a half to 3 hours like very densely and making sure that I don't think I will ever make longer games than that, but I think I will continue to fill them out more, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's always this very sweet message at the end of the games and like in stuff you put out generally, which is like, thank you for spending some of your time on Earth playing my game, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like there's like a will to kind of how it gives people something in time they can manage.
Yeah. And isn't it like, do you feel this way with your podcast? Isn't it just like a very humbling thing that someone does only have so many thousands of hours in a lifetime, and someone's choosing to listen to you for 45 minutes throughout their week? And yeah, isn't that just such a humbling thing that anyone would spend their life with your work?
It is, and I love that this sentiment kind of folds in like bleakness and joy together. It's like this little existential moment where you're like, life is very, very, very short. And so thank you.
Yeah. Life is so short, and isn't that beautiful? There's definitely beauty in limitations and melancholy for sure.
Right, and that's a big part of what seems to be the core of the games that you've made. Like there is a super strong aesthetic to them. There is all of this dry sort of assemblages of things that are found things and ornaments and these skeletal creatures and these decomposing bodies and bones everywhere. There's like a super strong existential threads running through it all, but it also comes across in such a gentle way. Like it's like this kind of gentle acknowledgement of that human condition without like a bludgeoning you with it or sort of falling into despair, if you know what I mean.
Oh, thank you. That's such a lovely description. Yeah, I want it to feel like you're having, like you're sitting in the park with your partner or your best friend and talking about how you are scared to die, but also, like, isn't it amazing that we get to love each other and sit in this park right now and feel the sun on our skin?
Yeah, and there's loads of moments in the game too. I think one of my favorites was like, there's little moments that take you by surprise, like in the museum, there's two people sitting, I think it's the museum, and you come over and their hands are almost touching, and they're like maybe on a date, and like you're in this like little moment, you kind of go, like you're sort of stepping into this super personal little moment, and there seem to be kind of peppered throughout the game, these little moments that you've created, these little human moments.
Yeah, and they're definitely inspired by just like walking around, moving to a bigger city and walking around and seeing that there are so many people that are just in love and outside being in love, and that is like such a fundamental piece of human existence, is just connecting with another human and getting to go outside with them, or like getting to go to the museum with them, getting a coffee with them, and really cherishing like teensy weensy moments where you're almost going to hold hands, but maybe you won't.
Yeah, the illustrations themselves, actually, like I think it's such an interesting combination, like the beaky skeletal figures with their empty eyes, but they do have like little outfits and stuff, and they look kind of contemporary. They're clearly like, I don't know what they are, they're kind of dead, not dead things, just walking around, these little existential husks, just shuffling around the city. And the style of the drawing seems to be a whole thing in itself. You know, it brought to mind things like Edward Gorey to me. I think I mentioned this in another show, the Gashlycrum Tinies, and this kind of slightly dreadful, slightly funny, like a kind of construction. Is how is the illustration style like a part of the game to you?
Yeah, I think so. I've talked about this in another interview, but I am a programmer by trade. That is like where I'm most comfortable. I'm really good at any kind of just like technical making. But the drawing aspect was not something that I was very good at first. And so I made it my New Year's resolution in like 2018, I think, to just draw every day. And it is amazing that you can just get better at something. And I think with drawing, there's such a visual representation of your growth. You can see yourself get better through like looking at your little files and seeing how you've grown from year to year and even month to month. Especially at the beginning, you're growing so rapidly when you start a new skill. And I think with Landlord, I was like getting there. With Landlord, the palette is like warmer toned. I'm like starting to use some like lighter tones. Whimsy's very blue. I was using a lot of blues in Whimsy. In terms of like the creatures, I don't exactly know how that happened. There's some of them in Landlord. I had drawn some of them in Landlord originally, and then I think I just like that shape a lot. And the eyes, in terms of them being hollow, I just don't know how to draw eyes. I don't know. Never got good at that. And so drawing a hole is easier than drawing the eyeball for sure. And yeah, I'm very fond of them. I love those little characters. And I think you're right that their outfits are kind of important, because other than that, you can't really, they all look similar. They all have their little like twig branches for ears. And other than the eye color in their hole, you can't differentiate them very, very, very much. So yeah, their little outfits are important. Most of them are wearing their little like collars. They have their little joggers on. So yeah, I'm very fond of them, but I don't exactly know. I wish I had like a better through line of the creative path that led me to making them, so that way I could do it again with like other creatures and stuff.
Right, they're like a bunch of little strange dried out like plague doctor hipsters.
Yes,
like
perfect description.
Yeah, with these big beaky faces, they are very charming. I'm very surprised about your path with drawing. Actually, I'd assumed that, I don't know, I'd built this whole picture in my mind. I realize now that like you've been like filling sketchbooks since the age of 4 or something, and have kind of come into games rather than the other way around, starting with games and going into drawing. I'm really surprised by that, because it seems like such a refined style that you've arrived at.
Thank you. I wish that I had been drawing since 4. I wish that I had started any skill at 4. I'm so envious of people who like learned how to program when they were like kids and now have this like huge amount of skill set under their belt that will take me so much longer to achieve. But that is the crux of life, isn't it? That you have to start somewhere, and sometimes you don't get to start as early as you want, and you don't have as much time with a thing as you want, which I think is motivation for making more things. You only have so much time, not to pull back to our mortality, but you only have so much time to make things.
I think it's good to be comfortable with mortality. I think a lot of people don't think about it. Think about it either too much or not enough, and just end up with general anxiety. Think about it just a healthy amount all the time. Yeah. Maybe that's the way.
Yeah, let it be an underlying hum, and no more than that and no less than that.
But when it comes to the drawing in the worlds as well, I wanted to ask you about like the idea of the warm, wet heart, which is like a kind of key line at the start of the game. It's very arresting line. And then being in this world where everything seems to have desiccated and dried out a little, and it seems a little, it's full of life, and there are creatures moving around, but it's also lifeless. Everything is dry, and there's vases of flowers are all dry. But then there is this other expression of like the gristle and blood and kind of being, the matter of being as well. It seems like a really interesting thing to just sort of separate it out that way and make this very dry world. It seemed brittle and kind of fragile and quiet. Oh, yeah. It's interesting. Like, how did you arrive at this?
I think I'm just bad at drawing any kind of goopy thing, and I think also the dryness gives it a bit more, or makes it a little bit more palatable, maybe. If you're not looking at like the goopiest heart in the world, it's easier to kind of separate yourself from like that you are actually building the human. So I think it's mostly just lack of skill in terms of drawing something really goopy. But I am glad that it comes off as like a really deliberate choice.
It does. I thought about it a lot. I thought about, like, you know, when you go into other people's houses and they have different things there. They have different things that you have, and they've thought about things differently. Yeah. Sometimes you come into someone's house and there is like many, many dried things and many shelves of books. And then you come into someone else's house and it's like a jungle, a verdant jungle full of plants and stuff. Yeah. And it's very interesting that this world seems to have been, like, you pushed all of that stuff so far back that it becomes this really dry, brittle world, and that has a feeling that is associated with it, you know? Yeah.
I think this description of other people's apartments is something that I was like so inspired by too, is like how many, especially living in a larger city and seeing just like rows and rows of windows that, you know, people live in and have their own choice of trinkets that they've like collected and they all mean something to them. That was very inspiring to me. And like the fact that you can't know all of them, that you are limited by time and connections, that you will never get to see everyone's apartment in the world. But I would love a collection I would love if everyone just had to submit a little essay of the trinkets that they have and why they're important to them.
Right. So this is like, as well, like an expression of that curiosity, right? In the absence of being able to see in all the windows and find out what's going on in all of the people's minds. Like in the game, you can do that. You can read the email. You can kind of watch the situation, and you can go into the house, even if the person's in bed and their little bony hand waves you away. You still get to like poke around in their stuff. So it's like this quite curious exploration that you get to do in the game.
Yes, that I would love to do in real life. So just a legal way of exploring that through a video game.
There's some sort of searching that goes on in these games, right? There's a few different types of searching in here. Like in Landlord of the Woods, you're searching for seemingly like an escape from a life where not happy, and into a kind of a fantastical place or outside of the city where everything is complicated and expensive and busy, into the nature where there is space and strangeness and room for magic. And it seems like in Birth there is a clear search going on there as well for companionship as well. So it seems like that's something that leapt out of both of the games, was this like seeking opportunities for change and magic in life. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm doing the exact thing you said now, where you talk to people and they just spout all of their ideas to you.
I know you're doing an amazing job of it too. I've never really thought about this. this aspect of my life and how it got put into games. So no, keep going. You're doing an amazing job.
But I guess it's a little bit like the curiosity about others and their closed minds and closed houses, and their internal dialogue. It's a little like seeking moments where magic can occur in situations that feel perhaps a little stiff and set, if you know what I mean. It seems to kind of fall out between the gaps when you're playing these games.
Yeah, and I think there's also a seeking of like an answer to those. Like I'm making the game as like I'm 25, I'm not happy at my job. What is the solution? And the same with Birth is like I'm so lonely. What is the solution to this loneliness? And there's not, there's not one given answer. And so I think I really value the unanswerable questions, the unsolvable, the unfindable questions. And it's more of like having a conversation about this is how I'm feeling. How are you feeling about it? So yeah, I think there is a lot of searching just in life. And that's part of the beauty of it, is that we do get to have the search. I think curiosity is just like one of the very, very best things, one of the very best qualities a human can have. So I think it's important to document I know it's very cliche, but the journey, not the destination. And so like the searching, not necessarily the answer, is what's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lovely moment again. Like if there is strange, if you see like a life on a pinboard or read an autobiography, it's like very much like the birth, the degree, the marriage, and then the child, and then the house, and then the death, and they're all the pins in the board. But the spaces in between are where everything is really happening, right? And they are not pins on the board, but they are so interesting. Yeah.
Oh, that's a beautiful visualization of life, is the strings in between the pins.
Yeah, and I think that these games and your work does a great job at expressing that and opening up those little parts that maybe are thought of as the between times and are thought of as not important, but actually are the most important of all. It's like the dark matter of life that's filling in all the gaps,
Oh, that's so beautiful. Oh my God, the dark matter of life. That's so lovely. Yeah, I think that, like we were saying, I think if you make something on your own, if you're a solo creator, you have a lot more leeway in not telling this like grandiose story. And hopefully, I think as game development becomes more accessible and we have more diverse people making games, hopefully we get a lot more slice of life stories that aren't these like big hero's journey kind of things. Because I think that's really important. And I hope that our medium like keeps growing in that way as we have more diverse people making things and telling stories.
Yeah, it seems like that's starting to happen a little, right? Sort of, there are quite interesting games coming out, and more interesting, like as you said, more diverse people getting access to making games and coming into game development. I noticed when I was looking at your publisher's website, actually, that it seems to be focused around female developers, trans developers, and marginalized people and things like that. So that seems like a really interesting launch pad for some other good projects too, right?
Yeah, and I hopefully we will see like many more women and non-binary humans making things, because that's I think also, like you were saying, I think this was in the Norco, the interview you did with one of the Norco devs, when they were talking about coming from different backgrounds into game development, and the same as you, coming from a different background and getting into games. That I think is, if you don't have this like built up backlog of games that you played as a child, you have, and I think that's where Whimsy and Landlord and Birth all thrive, is because I didn't play a ton of games as a child, and so I didn't really know the rules of what games were supposed to be. And so I think people coming from different fields create like more unique experiences because they don't have like these like design structures ingrained in their brain as defaults.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like there's generationally just been interesting people coming into games. Like I think of Kentucky Route Zero. I think I talk about that game every single episode of this podcast. So it's just like such a touchstone for me of like people coming into making games from different disciplines and bringing all they have with them, and ending up with such special and interesting games. And it seems to be a lot of people getting more curious. Maybe it's the growth of games as a medium, as a space where you can do interesting things, and that's attracting different kinds of people. And so we're just getting very rich tapestry of stuff coming out, you know?
Yeah, rich tapestry. That's beautiful. Yeah, I think you're right too. Just the accessibility, the fact that it's easier now than ever to make a game and get started on making something. And also that I think there's just way more funding opportunities for people in general. So hopefully we start to just see weirder. And I think I was talking about this with Ashley on a different podcast, but we were talking about the Steam Deck and how the Steam Deck is making indies more accessible to because it's so hard to port, obviously, to Switch or Xbox. So usually indies don't get to be played on the couch for the most part. And now the Steam Deck, you can play all these weird student projects on the Steam Deck on your couch, which is amazing. I want to play more weird things on the couch.
Right. I mean, I was going to ask you about that actually, but I didn't want to. You've got your game release coming up, and I didn't want to pour this on you. But I was wondering if if there are any plans to take it elsewhere outside of Steam onto different platforms.
Yeah, I would love to see it on all the consoles, but I've never ported anything before, so I don't have anything to announce yet.
But just to round things out, it's super exciting that the game is ready. It's super exciting that it's going out to the world. So what does your week look like? You've got three days until the game is out. What are you going to be up to?
So I'm finishing a few admin stuff and adding tiny bits of polish, tiny little details that my partner talks about this a little bit with his creative work, but that every teeny weeny thing that you add could be someone's favorite part of the game, which I think is just a beautiful way to think about adding more and more and more to the game. So I'm trying to add teeny polished things that won't break the game, and then playing through Birth probably 25 more times to make sure that I'm catching all of the bugs, and mostly just talking to people who have played the game and preparing for the launch. And then on Friday, it comes out at 9 a.m. Central Time, and I will be making chocolate-covered strawberries on that day, and hopefully just relaxing. And then I'm going to get my booster the next day, so hopefully everything will go well. Hopefully Birth's launch is so exciting, and then I will get my booster. Sounds
like you've got a good plan there. Chocolate-covered strawberries. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Yes. Well, I hope that everything goes well with the launch of the game, and congratulations on it. It's really wonderful. It's really specific and unusual, and it was a real pleasure to play it, and I'm glad that it exists. And thanks for the game. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for your time. Thank you so much for spending so much time with Birth and forming such beautiful thoughts about it.
Thanks a lot, Madison.
Thanks, John.
So I hope you enjoyed that interview with Madison. Thank you again to Madison for the time and for that great chat about the game Birth. It is out now on Steam. Fully recommend going and playing it. If you would like to hear more about Birth and my experience of playing it, there is also another accompanying episode that came out last week in which I review the game and talk about it some more there. So you can always go and listen to that one as well. And as for what's coming up next week, there's a lot on the docket actually. I'm not sure where my attention is going to go. I'm having a great time with Wild Hearts. I think I'm going to go and play it as soon as I'm finished recording this podcast. I also have A Space for the Unbound. I'm working my way through that one. There are a few more games that I've got going on in the background. I'm still playing a little bit of Blacktail, the kind of first-person Skyrim-y, witchy, dark folktale game that I've been playing as well. And Jack Move, the really cool pixel art, top-down, cyberpunk style Zelda type game. So I've got loads going on at the moment. So maybe next week I will talk more about one of those games. Or as always, it might end up being something else completely, if something just springs out of the woodwork. I hope that you will tune in and join me for that. You can also come and join the Discord if you would like by supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/gaminginthewild. I'm also on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter, on Instagram, various social media places. I've been using the YouTube channel lately and posting video episodes of this podcast as well. So you can find me on YouTube, find me on all of that social media at Gaming in the Wild. I would love to hear from you in the comments or via tweets or whatever. So please do get in touch if you've got a game that you would like me to talk about, a game that you think that I would enjoy, or if you've got feedback on the show or anything else, or if you've played Birth and you'd like to tell me about your time with Birth. And thanks very much for listening. See you next week. Take care of yourselves and each other, and bye-bye for now.